Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Holevoet. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for Dairy Business Association and Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative. I'm joined by my colleague, Aaron Stauffacher, the Associate Director of Government Affairs for DBA and Edge. We're very pleased to have all of you join us today as we walk through the government's response to COVID-19 and its implications on agriculture. I can say that when we were putting this presentation together, we were going to focus primarily on some of the federal actions and federal bills that have been passed and kind of walk through those with you all. Since we organized this webinar, there's obviously been major developments here in Wisconsin with the disposal of loads of milk yesterday and more of that anticipated going forward. We'll definitely touch on that as well. And we'll also reserve plenty of time for questions at the end. Before we begin, I do want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Feed Time. We're joined by Tyler Morgan from Feed Time, and I believe Tyler would like to say a few words, and we'll also play a video for you about the company. Tyler?
Are you guys there?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, just wanted to say thank you very much to Edge and DBA for all the hard work you guys are doing. So Feed Time, we're a pretty small startup, but we're a pro dairy company. Basically what we do is we make it easier for dairies to get their feed pricing from their feed mills, manage feed orders. If you look at the landscape of ag before COVID, the landscape was changing rapidly. As many of you guys know, you're very busy. This puts access to your feed pricing and making orders very easily. It also saves your feed mills a lot of time. I was watching Twitter last night and just see guys dumping out milk. There's just a lot of crazy things going on right now, and I think we need all hands on deck, every solution we can. Feed Time wanted to offer, Feed Time's always been free for dairies, but if there's any feed mills that might be on the call, we can open up Feed Time for free for your feed mill. To send out feed pricing and help manage orders, send out invoicing to any feed customers that you might have. So thank you very much for having us.
Our pleasure. Again, thank you for your support and helping to make this webinar possible. I'll play your company's video here. Thanks again, Tyler, and thank you to Feed Time. Oops. Sorry, guys. So again, we're just going to walk through a few things. I'm going to begin by talking about the our Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which was the second federal piece of legislation that was passed in response to coronavirus, the first really big one. Then Aaron's going to take over and talk about the CARES Act, which is the third piece of legislation that's even larger than Families First in response to this crisis. And then we're going to talk about some administrative flexibility, what's going on in Wisconsin, and we'll also sort of talk about what might be on the horizon next, both state and federally, as far as government's response. And then we'll leave plenty of time, like I said, for questions. So first thing to discuss is the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. At least of interest definitely to agriculture was a significant investment in public nutrition programs in that legislation. You can see there over $1 billion in new spending for those programs, $500 million for the WIC program, $400 million for food banks, $100 million in nutrition assistance for U.S. territories. This would be Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and the like. $250 million in nutrition assistance for the aging and disabled, programs to help maintain school lunches for kids who are now out of school but would otherwise receive free or reduced price lunch, and additional SNAP flexibility for states to suspend work and work training requirements, and also to try to provide maximum benefits as they expect the number of folks who are receiving SNAP assistance to increase dramatically as we are more and more of the population shelters in place. Another part of the Families First response deals with Emergency Family and Medical Leave Act expansion. Some of this is important for you all in part just because as employers, you would play a role at least in how some of this is implemented. It would expand the coverage of FMLA. Eligible employees would mean an employee who was employed for at least the last 30 calendar days. Employers here are those with fewer than 500 employees, so pretty much all farms with employees would fall into this bucket. If you have they created a new category called qualifying need related to a public health emergency. And you can see that it's pretty broad for what would qualify. It could be that you've been ordered or recommended to stay home because you have symptoms or you've been exposed to the virus. It could be that you have a family member or a child who needs care because they have been exposed or have symptoms, or child care providers unavailable because of the health emergency, which is true of most people who had external child care. So a lot of people could qualify for FMLA under this provision, including many people who otherwise would not be able to qualify for it. The first 14 days that an employee would be out on FMLA for this purpose would consist of unpaid sick leave, although the employee may substitute vacation, personal, or sick leave time that they otherwise have through their employer. Employers would then have to provide paid leave for each day of leave after the 14 days. Benefit amounts equal to 2/3 of the employer's regular rate of pay. So that's what would be being paid to the employee. For employees with variable hours, they'd look at sort of the average number of hours they would work and determine what their rate of pay would be. And there is some additional help for employers who would have to be making these payments to try to help cover their expenses as well. Then, there's also some changes to paid sick leave under that provision that definitely impact all employers. Again, an employer here is defined as a private entity with fewer than 500 employees, again, covering all farms that have employees, or presumably most farms that have employees, and public entities with one or more employees. Here, they would be required to provide sick time for people under the following conditions: if they're subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order, if they've been advised by a health provider to self-quarantine, if they are experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and are seeking medical diagnosis, they're caring for an individual who is subject to one of those first three things, or is caring for a child whose school or place of care is closed. Again, that's the big one that really impacts a huge portion of the population. Full-time employees are entitled to 80 hours of paid sick time in addition to any paid sick time they already have. They would get their regular rate of pay when an employee is unable to work, and 2/3 rate of pay because the employee is unable to work because they're caring for another, including a child. So slightly reduced level of payment there. Part-time employees would be entitled to the number of hours that they would typically work in a 2-week period of time. That's how you'd calculate how many hours of paid sick time they would have. An employer may not require an employee to search for or find a replacement employee to cover those hours. An employer may not require an employee to use the paid leave before using their traditional paid sick time if they're offered that as part of their employment. Employers are also prohibited from discharging or disciplining an employee who takes the leave. And there's also a notice, and we'll try to push out, this will all be recorded and available after the fact, including the presentation slides, but there's a helpful link to the notice that you would be required to post by the Department of Labor. You should already have that, hopefully, and should already have that posted. If not, you are required to do so. So please check out that link and get the posting materials that you need. There are tax credits for paid sick leave and for family medical leave. Employers are eligible for tax credits equal to 100% of the qualified sick leave paid. There are caps on those wages that you see there outlined. For self-employed individuals, which might apply to some of the folks on the call here, there's a tax credit equal to 100% of what would be the qualified leave equivalent. Employers are similarly eligible for 100% of the qualified FMLA that it's paid. The credit, again, is subject to certain caps, can't exceed $200 per day, or an aggregate $10,000 per quarter. In the case of self-employed individuals, again, there is a way for them to recoup those costs for the equivalent of the FMLA they would have taken. And the IRS has issued guidance to help you navigate that. We, as an organization, are contemplating an additional webinar just focused in on the paid leave aspects of this to delve in more in depth for those of you that still have questions or concerns about it. But this guidance document, again, available through that link that you should be able to access, might be helpful going forward as well. There's money out there. This doesn't necessarily impact farmers, but good to know, at least for those of us who might be laying people off through this time period. This bill authorized an additional $1 billion in emergency grants for states to help shore up unemployment insurance. You've probably seen reports both nationally and here in the state about the surge in unemployment compensation claims. So it is definitely a problem. In addition to those money, they're also offering interest-free loans to help pay for this program through the end of the year. And there's special provisions made for states that see an increase of over 10% in claims. Also, several health provisions that are just sort of interesting for anyone, maybe not specifically for this agricultural audience, but again, all of us are concerned about the health of ourselves and our families and our workers, and trying to navigate through this period of time. So there are provisions that would provide for free diagnostic testing, provide that private healthcare plans cover that, waive Medicare and Medicaid costs associated with COVID-19 visits, and treat personal respiratory protective devices as covered countermeasures available for certain coverage as well. So again, things to sort of make sure that people aren't hesitating to go in, seek treatment, and also seek diagnosis if they suspect they have the disease. And that's it for Families First. I'll turn it over to Aaron to talk more in depth about the CARES Act.
Thank you, John. This is Aaron Stauffacher, John's colleague, and I am going to try to tackle the bill that was passed and signed into law last Friday. However, before I do that, I do want to mention that the links that John mentioned can be found in the chat box on your GoToWebinar toolbar. So if you see the chat box, click down and you'll be able to access those links from there. It's also important to note, and I'll just put this out there right now, that this is also the opportunity where you will be able to ask questions at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I will try to tackle this $2 trillion stimulus package that was passed last Friday. And because it was passed last Friday, I will just put it out there that this thing is so large, it's 880 bills or 880 pages. So there's a lot to be determined and figured out yet. As I'm sure you all are well aware, their information comes out daily, almost hourly in some cases. So I'll try to do my best to focus on the things that you probably are wondering about and have questions about. And so I will jump in with some of the few headlines that you all probably heard about. I'll just tackle these and get these out of the way right now. These are the ones being focused on with media. So as you guys know, there is a certain aspect and a huge pot of money, almost 1/4 of the pot of money, going for direct financial assistance for the one-time payments for individuals and couples, starting at or maxed out at $1,200 for individuals and $2,400 for couples, and then $500 per child. The Government and Treasury Department will be using your 2019 tax returns if you file them. However, if you did not file them, they will be using the 2018 information. And then, because this is a phase-out program, the phase-out will be starting at $75,000 for individuals, and then capped at $99,000, and then $150,000 starting for couples, and then capped at $198,000 for depending on your AGI. How it's determined between there, it's a $5 payment reduction per $100 you make beyond that $75,000. Also, one noteworthy thing to add, for unemployment insurance, it boosts what folks already receive in the amount of an additional $600 a week for the next 4 months. But then it also importantly expands it to self-employed people and as well as independent contractors, folks that have not necessarily been able to access unemployment insurance before. I'm sure you've all heard of the next few big bullet points there. A lot of money, 1/4 of the $2 trillion going for large business assistance focused on loans, loan guarantees, or investments. And then secondly, which you are probably all wondering about, is the small business assistance, which makes up a total of $367 billion into a few different programs, which I'll touch on in a little bit. And then I threw these on there because they are important in making the headlines that, there's a good chunk of change going into keeping our airline systems up and running, with a main focus in keeping employees employed, as this was one of the main focuses of the bill. Keep people working and keep businesses running. And then expectedly, there's a big chunk of money going into our healthcare system to make sure rural hospitals are well equipped, staffed, and be ready to take on this virus. So I'm going to break it down into 3 buckets. So what's in it for dairy and agriculture? So I'm going to break it down into what the U.S. Department of Agriculture got, and then I'm going to touch about some of those small business loans, specifically the EIDL loans, and then the Paycheck Protection loans. And then I'm going to touch on a few other provisions that might spark your interest and ones that you might want to consider. So jumping into what USDA got. So USDA was funded just short of $50 billion in this program. So I think it's important to note that a certain chunk of that, 22.5 billion, is provided for farm assistance in the bill. And there are no programs available yet. EDGE, DBA, many other agricultural organizations are working with lawmakers, are advocating to USDA to determine how that money should be spent. I think it's important because no programs have been made available yet to take a look at some of the data that USDA is looking at. I found this graph from our friends from American Farm Bureau put together in their economist department, and I think it really shows, the market hurt everyone's taking, not just in dairy, but all of agriculture. So this really shows our importance of getting into USDA, contacting congressional folks, and letting know dairy's an industry worth advocating for and spending money on. And so that will be important as we go forward in the next couple of weeks as this virus develops. So the two big farm assistance programs are one, it was a $9.5 billion allocation to the Office of the Secretary. And I think it's important to note that the legislative text specifically named some producers over others. And to our pleasure, the legislative text specifically named dairy producers along with livestock producers, folks that produce specialty crops, as well as those who serve our localized food chains, such as those who serve farmers markets, as well as folks that are in the more niche localized markets. And this, some have called it, a big pot of money for the Office of the Secretary to really determine and make decisions over the next few weeks for which industries in which programs money should be allocated to. So it will be important to advocate, and as we've been doing, our most recent latest of yesterday. And just to provide a little bit of perspective on this 9.5 billion. So when the CARES Act was being negotiated, discussed out in Congress, we're talking, ideas were being thrown around over a week ago of what would actually make it in the package that was passed on Friday. So they went with a broad approach rather than trying to make legislative carve-outs before they really knew where the coronavirus and COVID-19 would really have an impact in agriculture. And as John mentioned, we are seeing some of those things play out as early as this week. The second pot of money in that in the Farm Assistance Program is $14 billion to replenish the Commodity Credit Corporation. So the CCC is the funding mechanism for the regular agricultural programs at USDA, some of which you're very familiar with, like the price loss coverage program and the dairy margin coverage programs, but it also bolsters other commodity and income support programs. It also includes natural resource conservation programs, disaster assistance programs, and then most recently it was used for the market facilitation program. So this $14 billion replenishment for this fiscal year 2020, that was really in addition to the second and third tranche of MFP payments that were made recently, as well as the Farm Bill payments that were made last fall. So this replenishment is really meant to allow USDA to develop the new support programs that will be needed to assist agricultural producers, as well as potentially look at agricultural businesses. As in the first bill, there was even more money put into the food and nutrition assistance programs. As you all know, USDA, one of their main program goals is to make sure that food gets to the folks that need it most. And this is important to you in the agricultural community because ultimately it helps move products, right? It helps people get in the grocery stores. It helps them buy the products that that we all produce. So there was a significant chunk of money given to the SNAP program to help cover food costs and any surge in the enrollment due to the increase in unemployment because of the layoffs and business closures due to the coronavirus. There was also a small money appropriated to provide grants for underserved areas. 100 million of that is targeted for the Indian reservations around the United States, and with the remainder of it going to the U.S. territories like Puerto Rico. The next tranche of money, $8.8 billion, is targeted at our child nutrition program. Most notably, the school lunch program is within that. And so we're going to see a lot of ideas come about, how to get kids the food that they need for the rest of the school year, as well as continuing in the summer months. And that is also put in there to protect against any surge in child nutrition program enrollments due to the coronavirus. Close to $500 million was allocated into the commodity assistance programs. So these are the programs that allow USDA to buy foods for food bank distributions, as well as provide buy some commodities to provide through their other channels. So this is important for you as agricultural producers as well as agribusinesses. This funding is very important so we can continue to move product and then make sure it gets to the folks that need it most, really, in this time. I do not have a slide on the others because I want to be conscious of our time today. But there was close to $500 million authorized in other category, and I'm going to simplify it and basically say this is money that was authorized to keep the supply chain going within USDA, FDA, as well as provide critical need investments. Well, what are those critical need investments? Well, with everyone working from home, especially in the rural countryside, like many of you are, we're still, broadband is still an issue in many parts of the Midwest. So there was a substantial investment into broadband funding in rural areas, but also a significant pot of money went to keeping the food safety inspections up and running. And this is important so the meat processors and packers can continue to pack food as something we might get into a little bit later. There are certain things that the USDA and other agencies cannot provide flexibility on, and that is what is already in statute, not necessarily in administrative code. So a lot of this funding is going to the things that USDA is required to do in statute to keep the food supply chain going so we can continue to move products and folks can continue to receive our products. So next, this is the second bucket I wanted to talk to you all about today. So this was the $367 billion that was allocated into the small business loans. First, I just want to clarify, there's been a lot of confusion out there regarding the loans available and kind of who's eligible, who's not eligible. And so I just wanted to make it very simple and break it down into, you're probably going to be hearing through the SBA program about two different types of loans that SBA is making available through the CARES Act. The first one I have up there is the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, and there's $10 billion allocated to that. I will say that farms are not currently eligible for that program. However, other agribusinesses are. These are loans, I can't remember the maximum cap on each one, but these are folks that their business is really at the threat of shutting down or closure or limiting their business due to government closures and limitations. I will mention EDGE, along with many other ag groups out in DC, are pushing to try to open this up to see if farms are eligible. We've currently signed on to a letter with many other ag groups to SBA. However, this might need to be a congressional change if and when they come back to do a technical fix bill or a fourth stimulus package. Long story short, the economic injury disaster loans, farms aren't currently eligible. However, other agribusinesses are that might be listening. So that's something to definitely look into. So for the Paycheck Protection Program, this is probably the one that many of you have been hearing about. So right now, I'll say this: farms may be eligible. I think there's a strong indication out there that farms will be eligible. However, if your specific farm will be eligible, it might be dependent on further SBA guidance. There's some ambiguity in the CARES Act in terms of the restrictions on the size of businesses within the SBA small business loan programs. However, it might be a good idea to reach out to your lender right now and be talking about it. We're planning on some further member communications on this front. Like I said earlier, this bill was just passed last Friday. Guidance is updated almost daily, but SBA is still working on a lot of the guidance regarding the Paycheck Protection Program. The first little bit of information since it was passed last Friday was released by the U.S. Treasury Department just on late Wednesday afternoon. Or was that Tuesday afternoon? So there's still a lot happening on this front. And if you look down to the chat box right down there, I did include a link to the borrower information sheet. But a little bit about the Paycheck Protection Program. So essentially, it provides small businesses with funds to pay up to 8 weeks of payroll costs. Funds can also be used to pay interest on mortgages, rent, utilities, and then funds are essentially provided in the form of loans that will be forgiven when the payroll costs, interest on mortgages, rent, and utilities are spent. There is a tip that I did include on the slide that SBA is warning that due to the high subscription of this program, that to really focus on using these funds for payroll costs, because there is the possibility that the funds used on some of those other things won't be able to be forgiven. A little bit about the loans themselves. So there's a maximum of $10 million, low interest rate of 0.5%, short term, and their payments are ultimately deferred for 6 months as showing on the screen. However, interest will be accruing over that time. How do you figure out your loan for your specific businesses? Well, it's very simple. So if you've been in business for over the last 12 months, you take your average monthly payroll cost, whatever that might be, and you times that by 2.5, and that's your maximum loan amount. And like I said earlier, these loans can ultimately be forgiven if they're used to fund payroll costs, mortgage interest, and the buckets that are listed on the screen. And it's also important to note the amounts forgiven will not be included or counted as income by the lender. And like I said, it's with everything moving very fast, this program is opening up shortly. And so it is a better idea to reach out sooner rather than later. Just so everyone knows, banks and lenders are still receiving a lot of information about this, still trying to figure out how to help you all be eligible for this program, and then make sense of the program. So they're working very hard, but I would start with going to your existing lender, and ultimately folks that are going to be able to administer the loan is going to be through an existing SBA lender or one that becomes certified in the next few weeks. There is one question that I'll just touch on right now, and that's regarding the immigration status of folks that dairy farms might be applying and how they apply to these loans. Unfortunately, right now, I do not have a very clear answer for that. It's going to take maybe a little bit more guidance from the SBA to come out, but it's still a good idea to at least touch base with your bank and just start accruing the appropriate information on that front. The other noteworthy provisions that I do want to touch on, and I did put these in order because with the PPP, just ending with the PPP, in that if you use the Paycheck Protection Program, you won't be eligible for the first two bullets on the screen, and that is the deferment of certain payroll taxes. So employers have the opportunity to defer their share of Social Security taxes through the rest of 2020. However, that will be due the next year end on December 21st, 2021, and then the second half be done on the year after that without any interest or penalties. Secondly is the employer retention credit. I don't see many farms being falling under the eligibility restrictions for this because to be an eligible employer, the operation of your business must be fully or partially suspended by government order, or your gross receipts fall by 50% over from the previous year, and that's on a quarterly basis. Hopefully, we will not get to that second point. But I did want to raise it because there is a restriction. If you use the Paycheck Protection Program, you will not be eligible for the benefit in the CARES Act with the employer retention credit. I do also want to mention one tax provision that I know accountants are figuring out how to utilize for your all businesses right now, and that is allowing a 5-year net operating loss carryback for the losses incurred in 2020, 2019, and 2018. And then also importantly, there was the 2017 Tax Act did restrict those NOLs to 80%. However, the CARES Act lifted that restriction and will allow you to use NOL at 100% for the tax years that began in 2018, 2019, and 2020. I will say this, as in the rest of the bill, a lot of these provisions are meant to provide money now, right? So I know I'm not touching on all of them. There's several out there, but we do want to leave a lot of time for questions. So I will now turn to the federal administrative actions. And John, would you like to take over here?
Thanks, Aaron. So in addition to the legislative action that we've just kind of gone through on the federal side, federal agencies have also been busy trying to draft guidance documents that might help explain how to deal with different problems that crop up during this crisis, and also ease potential problems that might have arisen because of it. For example, DHS has spent a lot of time going over what critical infrastructure is, making sure that there's guidance to define that. That's part of the basis for our exemption from our Safer at Home order of Governor Evers here in Wisconsin, is that agriculture has been included in that guidance as part of critical infrastructure. FDA has eased labeling requirements to try to make it easier for products that were prepared for the food service industry, which has obviously been largely closed in much of the country, or at least drastically scaled back so that they can only do takeout or delivery. But those items that are prepared for food service could be repackaged more easily to go into retail chains. and be sold there instead. The EPA has worked on guidance to allow more flexibility to permitted farms. And I should say that's really for all NPDES holders. Obviously, here in the state, we have WPDS permits issued by DNR, but that's part of the delegated authority to the state under the Clean Water Act. So there is some flexibility being provided by EPA for people who might have a reason why they would have difficulty complying with their permit because of struggles they face directly related to COVID-19. DOT has issued guidance to provide flexibility for CDL requirements and hours of service requirements to try and ease bottlenecks in transportation. And USDA and the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security have all worked together to try to continue having H-2B visa applicants come in, and also are doing things on the same time with H-2A, trying to make that process more, well, as functional as possible, considering that we're having a difficult time moving people around at all, let alone across international borders. Next, I want to talk just a little bit about some of the Wisconsin response. Obviously, if you're here in Wisconsin with us, you know we've been subject to a safer at home order from our governor already since the end of March, and it's scheduled to continue until April 24th. Fortunately, agriculture and related food processing industries are exempt. There was initially some confusion about how people who are exempt would be able to move around with or without documentation showing that they were employed in some sort of critical infrastructure or critical industry. No such documentation is required. Obviously, there's some farms who still prepared that, still provided it to employees, and maybe gives their employees some peace of mind, but it's not a requirement. The state also issued guidance in preparation for the possibility of milk disposal. Obviously, as we already discussed, that occurred for the first time in the state yesterday, and has been occurring in the Northeast in particular for a few days prior to that. There's also an executive order that provides more flexibility for those farms that have to dispose of milk who are non-CAFOs. So for non-CAFOs who are not subject to Clean Water Act requirements, and are not subject to a permit that they already have, they're given broader flexibility in dealing with milk disposal. In fact, they're basically exempted from the state administrative rule for runoff management as it pertains to the emergency application of milk on fields, provided they can show that they don't have any other alternatives besides what they're currently doing to apply. There are weekly and biweekly calls with DATCAP dealing with a whole host of agricultural issues, but we're consistently on those dealing with the dairy and meat supply chains. The dairy crisis team, which has worked on a whole host of issues, everything from disease outbreaks to animal abuse or mistreatment videos in the past, now is dealing with this. We've created a unified response from the dairy community that we've been able to share with our lawmakers and administrative agencies to try to keep the message clear and consistent. Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin has released a new ad campaign specifically addressing our current situation and the COVID crisis and how our dairy farmers are continuing to work to provide a safe and nutritious product to the rest of the public throughout this crisis. And if you haven't already seen those ads, they've just been released this week, but are already playing on both radio and television. Legislative work, at least in the state capitol, has been delayed. We were going to have a Senate floor date in late March. That's been put off until further notice. They are exploring the possibility of having virtual sessions that would not require them to meet in person. At least they had one trial run in the state Senate to see what that might look like. That would become particularly important as we look at what the state's response might be to COVID. The governor has put forward two different bill packages. The first one looked at things for this coming election on Tuesday of next week, with suspended voter ID requirements, broadened the ability to mail in your vote, and allowed electronic registration to be extended. Would have also provided funding for a whole host of activities most related to public health, increased staffing at the Department of DHS, as well as additional money for hospitals, healthcare providers, and local health agencies. He also has another new package that, again, doesn't have much that's ag specific. Most of it, again, deals with the public health realm, and also providing assistance to people who have been negatively impacted by the economic crisis caused by all of us staying at home. So those are out there. The Republicans in the state legislature are also working on some ideas about both how to spend some of the money that we'll receive because of the CARES Act as a state, although much of that is earmarked for specific projects based on the legislative language passed by the federal government. And then also going into this end of the session, we also had a state surplus or projected surplus, which now probably will be reduced, but still there's probably some state money that will be used as a stimulus or some sort of act to help mollify some of the negative impacts within the state of Wisconsin. Other states where EDGE members reside are doing similar things. They've either already acted or they're considering action on similar fronts, and we're trying to monitor that as best we can. We're certainly trying to make sure that we make it clear to our both the governor's office and the state legislature that we think any COVID relief package should definitely include agriculture. There were already some agricultural themed bills that were making their way through the legislature. They were still waiting for votes in the Senate. Some of those would have positive fiscal impact on farm operations, both dairies and otherwise. And now might be an excellent time to enact some of those as part of an overall strategy for COVID-19 relief. We're also working with our other partners, the cheesemakers, Farm Bureau, to try to get on the same page for what might be a unified approach for agriculture in requesting COVID-19 relief from the state. Aaron, do you want to talk about what's next?
So thanks, John. So I wish everyone, I wish everybody probably thinks, no one really knows what's in a crystal ball, but these are some of the things that we've been doing and are continuing to do, but in responding to this crisis. As we talked about earlier, that $9.5 billion at USDA, we are through our channels as well as public letters, we're trying to influence how that money will be spent and be directed to dairy farms and providing assistance. I think the two foremost priorities on that front are first, making sure our farmers that who have lost not only income from the markets going down, but the total amount of their income from being disposing of milk, finding a way in a program that we can to make those farmers whole that have had to dispose of milk. We've identified a few programs. We've shared those with USDA as well as key congressional lawmakers out in Washington, D.C. Secondly, focused on keeping our product moving through the supply chain, whether that's from your farm to your processor to their customers. Oh, that's not good. And making sure our dairy supply chain continues to work. So through the USDA authority, not only in the CARES Act, but their original section, through their emergency 32 spending authority to buy up commodity products. But right now we're specifically urging the government to spend their money on products that were originally targeted for food service. With so many restaurant shutdowns, hospitality shutdowns, a substantial demand for products that were going into food service has dried up. And so those products that have made their way into the supply chain but have not found their end customer, that's where USDA should be really focusing, and they can be making a demand or making a difference by focusing in on those products right now. There is precedent for buying dairy products that were meant for retail and then, or meant for food service, and then repackaging them into retail type packaging. I think that the US or the FDA flexibility as it relates to nutritional guidance, that certainly helps. That folks don't have to comply with quite everything that needs to be on a retail package, but also within that $450 million I talked about providing in food aid and commodity assistance programs, there's a certain chunk of that is dedicated for redistribution of the products that they buy. And as we've been doing over the next couple of weeks, we are continuing to deal with our various state and federal government agencies as they work through some of these additional flexibilities, how money is going to be spent, and then certain things that they can take action and do right now. And one thing that we did not include on this is there going to be a fourth legislative response package? I think many would be in agreement that we will see one. It's just a matter of when we will see that. The Senate is in recess until April 20th, 18 days away. However, the House is working just because the Capitol complex is shut down. Lawmakers are back in their district. I do know congressional staffers are working from home. There's a big focus to make sure that all of them have laptops to be able to do their jobs from home. So as you know, everyone's trying to figure out the administrative regulations on what was in the CARES Act. There's an enhanced focus on what does Congress need to do in terms of technical corrections, making sure what they intended is reflected in how the CARES Act language is applied on the nation, but then also fix some of those inadequacies that they didn't really foresee coming when they created this last week. So I will turn it over for questions. We do have a few coming in, but I do want to direct everyone to a page that we already have a lot of information on, and that is hosted at our Edge website. It's www.voiceofmilk.com/page COVID-19, all caps. On there we have a guide for dairy farm employers and dealing with employees who might come in sick, as well as prevention and control guidance for farms, as well as through some of our partner law firms. We do have some great resources on there from our friends over at Michael Best in terms of answering some of those more specific employee-employer guidance questions, as well as a few of their alerts as they have been coming out. So we will answer a few questions that have come in over the course of the webinar. And then for additional questions, you should see a question box or chat box within your webinar tool that you'll be able to type in questions. There's a few that I can answer right now, and I apologize that we didn't quite see them when we were talking about them, but they're pretty easy to knock out right away. And that is the first, when John was talking about the guidance from EOL and the employer posters, that notices are available in Spanish. There's a lot being translated from English and Spanish across all of the administration agencies' web pages for that stuff. Secondly, when do a lot of those labor provisions, when are they effective? A lot of them became effective this April. So it was a short turnaround time from when they passed all of the legislation to when it's ultimately enacted. So those DOL regulations will be in effect from here on out. And then before we start answering some of our other questions, the present one question I think applies to everyone. Will the slides and presentation be available post our presentation? The answer is yes. It will be under the DBA and EDGE members only section on our website. If you are not able to access that, please contact John or I. But I think your best bet would be trying to contact Joanna Guza, who's running the webinar behind the scenes today. So there's a few more questions that have come in regarding immigration status, whether it be a visa employee who's unable to obtain a Social Security number, and it is really difficult right now due to the SSA offices all being closed. Right now, at this time, I don't quite have an answer for you, but I do have your name and contact, and that's something hopefully we can follow up on. Another question that has come in, will DMC be reopening for enrollment? That is one thing I know USDA is probably considering. There's been a lot of attention focused on reopening up DMC for enrollment. It's probably something I don't have any concrete answer for you right now, as there's been very little information coming out of USDA and what they're going to be looking at doing. From a practical sense, I'll probably say that they're focused on some of the more very short-term aspects that have happened in the past week before they look more big-term. But reopening up DMC is something being advocated for out in DC, as well as being looked at by members of Congress as well as USDA.
I would just add that our Department of Agriculture sent a letter to Secretary Perdue, and one of the things that they asked for in that was also that he consider reopening the DMC enrollment period of time. That also has been a top priority of National Milk. So, as Aaron said, impossible to say whether or not it will work, but there are definitely people who are in the mix advocating for it.
Thank you, John. John, would you like to take the next question? Or I'll take the next question. So in regard to the Wisconsin slide, oh, sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead, Aaron.
Oh, so the question was in regard to the slide for the Wisconsin response, the third bullet. What does EO number 17 stand for?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we get into using shorthand. That's an executive order. So it's number 17. It's an executive order that was issued by the governor. It has many different components, actually, but one of the component parts was a section that basically allows for flexibility and, in most cases, an exemption for farms who are non-CAFOs from the requirements of NR 151 as it relates to the emergency application of disposed milk on fields.
So the next question is that dairy RP has already passed for the next 3 months. Will there be anything else out there for those who didn't purchase dairy RP? So I'm not sure. So dairy RP is a partially privatized dairy insurance program. So I'm not sure if there's going to be anything that the government can do in reopening it up for dairy RP. But as I stated earlier, there's a lot of work being done into what programs that USDA is going to be making available for those who have dumped milk, but also because those who have just because the markets have taken a big hit, looking at other financial assistance opportunities for dairy farmers among other commodities. And so that's one thing that we're talking a lot about with our congressional folks as well as with USDA. And seeing what programs, help everyone a little bit, at least a little bit. But I don't have any other question or any other response to, will there be anything concrete at this point for those who didn't purchase dairy RP? Like I already said, there might, an enhanced focus looking at DMC as well as other financial assistance programs out there in the coming weeks. With regard to one of those assistance programs, yesterday with the news of farmers having to dispose milk on farms, we have been working a lot over the past few weeks and planning for the worst possible contingencies, even though that they've been very hard to think about. One has been working with DNR and DACAP on guidance here in Wisconsin on how to deal with some of that milk. But also on the federal side, as there was a lot of money allocated to USDA, making sure that folks that do have to dispose of milk are reimbursed based off of production histories going into this situation. We flagged some programs that currently exist for other events where farmers have to dispose of milk. But at this time, I don't have anything 100% concrete to say one program will be implemented over another. There's a lot of attention and a lot of advocacy going on out in DC to make sure those farms that that are being forced to dispose of milk are made whole, to bring them back up with everyone else as well.
So I see a new question about dairy RP coverage, and unfortunately, that's probably one that I don't know the answer to, although I believe it is actually the latter. The question is about whether dairy RP will cover 100% of the cost or price of the milk dumped, or just the difference between the coverage and the federal milk marketing order price. That is a question, unfortunately, probably for your insurer, and I don't know that answer off the top of my head. I talked to the person who has your policy. Also, if you're a dairy RP policy holder, whether you've been asked to dispose of milk or not, I would urge all of you to sort of reach out to the person who you purchased your policy from to discuss what the proper what the proper way is to handle disposal. Dairy RP is based off of overall production history, so you still have to be able to show and verify production history. So you can't just dump it into the manure pit. It would need to be still quantified in such a way, and that might require you to transport the milk, weigh it, and then dispose of it after the fact. So again, sorry to Jason that I don't have an answer to your question. That's something that we can look into for you as well. But I would urge you to reach out to the person who sold you the policy, and again, encourage everyone who has dairy RP to make sure they know exactly what's expected of them in case of disposal for them to get maximum coverage. A related question to that from Roger about dairy RP, and the answer is yes. With those caveats I've already discussed, you would be able to use dairy RP to help compensate you for milk that you may have been asked to dispose of by your processor. Aaron, I also believe there were a few questions at the very beginning that we might have missed. I see one that deals with sort of the SBA PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, and whether it would only apply to citizens and how citizenship would be verified. I think Aaron alluded to this a little bit in his presentation, and I'll let him add anything to my response. But basically, right now we are on a wait and see stance on that. The guidance for PPP has yet to be released. They're currently writing it. It's a little awkward because, again, applications start tomorrow, and the guidance for the underlying program has not been released yet. But that's, just sort of the world we're living in right now, where things are happening that quick. So whether or not that's true, the restriction on citizens, that's to be determined. And then also to the second part of your question about how that would be determined or policed, is all probably subject, I would say, to that guidance document. And it may not even be in there, in which case it will be a question for later. Anything to add on that, Aaron?
No, I touched on that a little bit during the presentation, but yeah, I think you're spot on for where we are now, John.
Then we also got a question about whether
coming in. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm just trying to wrap up these few early ones. A note about whether the notice is available in Spanish. I assume you mean the unemployment or paid sick leave notice, not unemployment. We will look and see if we can't find that. I'm next to positive it would be. I'm not sure if it's easy to access from the link that we provided, but if not, we'll try and track down a link to a Spanish version and get that out there as well, add that to the resources available.
Thank you, John. There's a question coming in. Sorry. Go for it, John. Were you getting some of those early questions?
Yeah, I've got two more, I think. One I'm not sure I understand, but I see who it was asked by, so I will follow up with you afterwards to make sure I get you an answer, John. I think you're asking about an effective date, but I'm not sure when you asked that in relation to the presentation, so just want to make sure I'm answering correctly and about the right program. Then we also had a question about what are market administrators saying about leniency for private companies to pay below federal order minimums if milk needs to be disposed of. We haven't touched base on that particular issue with our administrator for our order here in Wisconsin. Current law would say that that would not be possible for a private purchaser. It would be possible, obviously, for co-ops, but not for a private company to do. I don't know if there's anything that would allow that. Even if the milk is ultimately disposed of. I mean, really, the the way around that for a private purchaser is unfortunately to make the farmer dispose of the milk and not pay the farmer for that milk. Sorry, one more. I have a TN. Oh, I'm sorry, Aaron, you answered that one. The TN. This is about the Social Security offices being closed. And back over to you, Aaron, for the new questions.
Yeah, so I'll touch on one, and that is, will we receive any updates from EDGE on federal, state, and local assistance? Many of you who are EDGE members should have been getting EDGE emails through our current communication system. If you are an EDGE member or a DBA member for that fact and are not receiving those emails, please reach out to one of us so we can get you on the list as we periodically provide updates on the situation as well as other information out there. And then there's a question about TN visa workers who need to go back and renew visas right now. John, do you want to try to tackle that one? Sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the perfect answer for you, Dorothy. I appreciate the question. For those TN visa workers, if now there's some question about whether they'd be allowed to travel back to the United States. I assume this person is from Mexico because they're a TN holder. They could also be from Canada, obviously. I traveled back from Mexico less than a full week ago without any difficulty whatsoever. They might be able to do the same, although things may have changed. And also, I obviously am a citizen. They're just a visa holder. But I can tell you that no one really checked or cared about that at customs at O'Hare, for me at least. So I'm not sure if they'd be allowed back in or not. I think really what they should try to do is contact their embassy or consulate here. The nearest one for you would presumably be, for a Mexican consulate, be in Milwaukee, as well as maybe the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, to try to get some sense for whether they'd be allowed to go back and renew and return, or if there's some sort of exception being made for people who are in the situation to allow them to renew in place, where they otherwise would not be allowed to do that. It is an interesting question. I might try and do a little more digging here and see if we can get you a better answer. On a personal and somewhat kind of unrelated note, at least my coworkers know we've just received a foreign exchange student here last Friday. We're his third host family. He's on a J visa that expires in July, which gives us some time, but at least right now, neither of the countries where he has citizenship are allowing anyone to come into the country, including citizens. So he's not allowed to travel back to his home country, and there are no commercial flights back to his home country. So I might be in the same boat as you, Dorothy, asking that question of what do you do about somebody whose visa is about to expire, but they can't go home?
So we're not seeing any other questions come in. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar and sticking around. Information is very fluid right now, and we're trying to keep everyone updated with information they need to know. But I would like to thank our sponsor, Tyler Morgan with Feed Time, just one more time. What we do on advocating for dairy wouldn't be possible without our sponsors, without our members. So thank you, Tyler from Feed Time, for sponsoring today's webinar. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to touch base with either John or I. Our emails are down there in the lower left-hand corner, or any other of our DBA or EDGE staff members, and we will try to provide an answer to your questions. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.